The bee right over there, it's a Sonoran bumblebee. It's one of our 9 bumblebees in Texas that you can find from central Texas all the way west to the Panhandle and the Trans-Pecos. I think when most people think of bees in Texas, the first bee people often think of is a honeybee, which is actually not native to Texas or even North America. But Texas is actually home to over 1,000 different native bee species. So European settlers brought over honeybees in the early 1600s for honey and wax production. So they're sort of like cows or chickens. They're not native to North America. They were brought over. Honeybees can be really effective pollinators, particularly in large agricultural production systems. But native bees do a really great job of pollinating our native plants because they've evolved over thousands of years to have really close relationships with when the plants are flowering and how to manipulate the pollen. Native bees are really important because any plant that has a flower can potentially benefit from pollination from that bee. So 1 out of every 3 bites of your food likely comes from a plant that was pollinated by a bee. And then about 80% of native plants here in Texas require bees or other pollinators in order to reproduce. The tricky thing about insects is that they mimic each other's coloring. So there are black and white wasps and flies and even beetles that will pretend to be bees. Wasp looks a lot like a bee because all bees were ancestrally wasps, so they evolved from wasps. They will have similar body shapes, but the main difference is that bees are hairy. So bees have branched hairs all over their bodies that help grab onto that pollen, whereas wasps, they primarily feed their young other insects, so they'll have smooth, shinier bodies with much fewer hairs. They sometimes look a little bit more svelte, a little more aerodynamic, but they're basically cousins to bees. And then they also have 2 sets of wings like bees do. Flies only have 1 set of wings, and they also have much smaller antennae in the front. The biggest bees in Texas are going to be your bumblebees and carpenter bees. Particularly in the spring, the female bumblebees can be up to 1 inch long, which is about the same size as our carpenter bees. So bumblebees are hairier, so just looking at the bee, if it's got a hairy abdomen or bottom, it's a bumblebee. If it's a large bee and it's got a shiny hiney, it's probably a carpenter bee. So the carpenter bees that we have here in Texas tend to be distinct in coloration from bumblebees as well. We have an eastern carpenter bee here in Texas that the abdomen's usually a blacker color compared to our bumblebee species that will have that gold and black banding. But there's parts of the US in which the coloration overlaps a lot. And bumblebees, they nest in the ground. They form a colony each year, and there's a queen that stays in the ground once it produces that first generation of offspring. And it can have up to a couple hundred individuals within one nest. Carpenter bees, they nest in wood. So if you have like a pergola or some standing wood on your property, you might have carpenter bee habitat, and they're solitary nesters. So females provision just their own nest, but there might be aggregation. So you might see lots of little nest holes along one piece of wood. A leafcutter bee is a type of solitary bee, so they make individual nests, and they use leaves and petals, sort of cutouts, to form the structures of the walls of the nest cells. So each little egg that's laid on a provision of pollen and nectar, a sort of pollen ball, has its own special lining. And they'll collect from petals and leaves and some other plant material. I often think of them as like the hole punch bees, because if you're walking around your property, you might not see these bees, but if you see leaves with really perfectly cut out circles, that's a good indication that you have a leafcutter bee on your property. They're about the same size as a honeybee, but they have black and yellow striping, but they can also vary a lot. So they can have white stripes, they can have sort of golden brown stripes. There's a lot of color variation, but they do usually have a striped abdomen. Most bees have what we call a scopa. So when we think about bees carrying pollen, we often think of a pollen basket or corbicula, which is something that honeybees and bumblebees and only a few other types of bees have. Most bees in the world, they don't have that special basket on their leg to collect pollen. Instead, they have really densely packed tufted hairs on their abdomen, and that serves as a spot to pack in the pollen. So if you see a bee with a very orange belly, that's not their actual hair color, that's pollen that they've collected in their foraging. So an orchard bee, also known as a mason bee, is closely related to a leafcutter bee, but instead of using plant material to line their nests, they collect mud and other masonry products, as we call it, to construct their nest cells from that mud. They come in a lot of different colors. There's green, blue, black ones, but the blue ones are really, really shiny and beautiful. So a mining bee, as you can guess, is really good at digging. So it's one of the most diverse groups of bees that we have in the family Andrenidae, and it constructs nests in the ground and excavates tunnels in order to build those nests. A lot of bees do this, but the mining bees are sort of especially known for this habit. So a sweat bee is a type of bee in the family Halictidae. They can have this very shiny green metallic, deep emerald color. Sweat bees are often attracted to perspiration, and it is famous for licking our sweat. And they'll just use their tongues to lap up a little bit of moisture and then the salts that we excrete in our sweat. So kind of think like they're using us as an electrolyte drink to fuel their flight. But usually just a little brush to get them to move away will be all that you need, and they don't tend to sting. Native bees are a little bit of an enigma. It's really difficult to get accurate population counts for insects because their numbers vary a lot year to year, and they're difficult to study down to that species level. But of the bees that we have assessed for extinction risk, about a third of them are vulnerable or at risk for declines. There are many more species that we haven't yet assessed, and there's initiatives underway led by the Xerces Society in partnership with TPWD to get a better handle on the state of the bees in the United States. But in general, we think that many of the stressors that are affecting other insect populations, like grasshoppers or dragonflies or butterflies, are also negatively affecting bees. The nice thing about bees is that if you enhance your habitats, if you enhance your yard a little bit, you can benefit them pretty quickly, because if you plant flowers, the bees will come. And so the three main things that I think about when I think about conserving bees at the small or large scale is to first, they need bare soil patches to access the soil to excavate nests, or they need twigs or either just dead stems from last year's flowers to nest within. So, leaving your yard a little bit messy can actually help the bees. Secondly, think about those flowers that you have on your property. So all bees need to collect pollen and nectar to eat, that's all they eat. And think about planting a diversity of flowers. So using the USDA guidelines of planting at least 3 flowering plants each that bloom in spring, summer, and fall, so 9 flowering plants total on your property, will ensure that there's something out there for when the bees are foraging. Some bees forage early in the season, so they're spring foragers. Some are really active in the peak of summer, and some don't really get to building up their nest until the fall. And so by ensuring that there's something flowering on your property at all times, you're more likely to support that diversity of bees. And then the last thing I like to talk about, which is a little bit tricky, is the use of pesticides. And we all know that we don't like getting mosquito bites here in Texas or having invasive plants on our property, but I kind of think about it as like the last resort to what you need to do to manage something. And rather than broadcasting your whole lawn in insecticide because you're worried about mosquito bites or chiggers, if you can kind of do it judiciously or in response to a particularly bad season, that would be helpful.
For more information about native bees, see the video description below.